our final discussion about difficult conversations, and that is on focusing on how to create a learning conversation. One thing to think about with difficult conversations is whether you should even have them. It's important to think about whether it's worth it to raise the issue. So think about, what is your purpose in having this conversation? Does it make sense to start it? It does not make sense to have this conversation if it's simply internal to you. Sometimes you've done something that's had a consequence and you're blaming yourself or you're being defensive with yourself, and this is all an internal monologue that's going on here. But instead you lash out at somebody else because you're looking for someone else to be at fault or for some other reason. If this is something internal to you, you don't need to lash out at other people. You can certainly ask others for their opinions or their help or their advice, but you don't need to make them part of the problem. Avoid externalizing the consequences of your behavior. It doesn't make sense to have a difficult conversation if there's a better way to solve it than to talk about it. Think about whether other solutions may occur. You may simply be able to fix the problem in a way that isn't going to recur. It doesn't make sense to have the conversation if that problem or that person is simply not going to change. Don't be too quick to think this. People often are capable of change, but that is not always true. And there's a lot of unhappiness that's created when we think we can change other people. You can change yourself, that's it. If you want other people to be different, you're going to be frustrated. Years ago, my mother-in-law said, women with children who work, they don't care about their children. They don't love their families. They're bad mothers. At the time, my sister-in-law, her daughter did not work, but had a small child. And the other sister-in-law did work. And this was not her daughter. This is her daughter-in-law. So the two daughters-in-law did work. The daughter did not. Realize how that sounded to me because I had small children and I worked. Remember when we spoke in the last lecture capture about the identity conversation? This is attacking my identity because my identity includes I am a good mother. And if someone says you're a bad mother because you do this, I will likely feel attacked by a threat to my identity. And again, our first response to attack is to get defensive. However, I'd seen enough of my mother-in-law to know that she was intractable. She had spent a life trying to control other people. She made it very costly to try to disagree with her, and it could cause only disruption. In addition, she lived 2,000 miles away, so I didn't really have to work out an ongoing relationship with her. I only saw her once or twice a year. And the cost would have been great. If I engage in a conversation with her about what it means to love your family, which includes earning money to support your family, incidentally, that I knew that conversation was never going to go anywhere constructive. I knew this was about her own fears and her own problems, frankly, and that I wasn't going to be helpful in creating a solution for those. I also knew that whatever I did would make life more difficult for my husband. He wasn't going to get another mother after all, and if his wife and mother are arguing with each other, it puts him in the middle. I wanted to avoid all of that. So in that circumstance, and frankly a few others with this mother-in-law, I played Barbie. I was pleasant, I smiled, I didn't say a word. It didn't help to have the conversation. It wasn't going to help anyone to have that conversation. So realize again, as a reminder that threats to your identity make it more likely you'll speak up, but ask yourself, is this actually going to help anything? It may, if it's not, why waste your mental energy? It doesn't make sense to have the conversation if it's only going to be a short-term solution, but the problem is long-term. Don't worry about little things that come up. If they don't have some larger significance, let it go. You want to play the long game. You don't want to fight about every single thing that ever happened. You don't want to focus on constantly needing emotional reassurance for everything that occurs. If something isn't truly important, it may not be worth having the conversation. Remember what your goals are. Remember what your values are. Sometimes what someone says is so clearly off the wall that you don't need to make it more important than it is. The authors now give us what they call liberating assumptions. And if you can incorporate these in the way you view things, it can be very helpful. Think about, it's not my responsibility to make everything better, but it is my responsibility to do my best. This is also illustrated with the idea that you can't make other people be different. You can make yourself be different, but you cannot assume responsibility for what everyone else does. Another liberating assumption is that the conflict doesn't define who you are. We all have various conflicts from time to time. It doesn't make you who you are. Just as you have shortcomings, other people do too. Letting go doesn't mean you don't care, and sometimes it's the most caring thing you can do. I've had parents in my office trying to change things for their children, their adult children. In fact, I just this morning got an email from a father saying, the father's secretary, what class does my son take? What are the prerequisites? What's the textbook? Who's the professor? Blah, blah, blah. If your son is an adult, which he is, he's in the university, how are you helping him by delegating the micromanagement of his education to your secretary? You're in college not just to learn about various topics, but also to learn maturity and how to be responsible for yourself. I don't think that's I think it's well-intentioned of the dad. I don't think it's an ultimately loving thing to do. Sometimes letting go, let your son make his own mistakes, give him all the guidance he needs, be available, but let him assume some responsibility for his life. That might be the most loving thing you can do. And there's a great quote from the Dalai Lama: if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. And if you want to be happy, practice compassion. Now, let's say that you decided to have the conversation. You believe it will be worthwhile. Again, start with an inquiring mind. Learn what their story is. Shift to curiosity. Start with I feel, I wonder, I noticed, instead of you. You didn't do this. You screwed up. You never do this. So start with your observations, I. Then step out of yourself for a minute and look at it from the third wall. How would a neutral person describe this? Someone who had nothing at stake in this. They would say, once you've had this learning conversation, here's how it looked to her. This is the way it looked to him. In other words, how would a neutral person describe it? That helps you become more objective. It helps you, in the words of Yuri, go to the balcony, look at it more objectively, step away. Now, engage in joint problem solving. Don't impose a solution. Next time you need to do X, Y, Z. Instead, invite solutions. They may well have some great solutions you didn't think of, and you're missing an opportunity. In addition, you'll get more buy-in, more allegiance if people feel like they're co-authors in the solution. Then it becomes theirs as well. View the problem, be hard on the problem, easy on the person, and that helps you create a partner in solving the problem rather than an opponent. Work on your listening skills. The term reflective listening. Reflective listening means that if you had to summarize what someone else is saying without editorializing, without passing judgment, what would it sound like? If you were simply paraphrasing what they were saying, what would that sound like? Okay, now say it. So when someone has told you their concerns, reflect that back to them. Do so without judging them or solving their problem. Oftentimes what happens when someone comes to us with a complaint or a problem is we interrupt them, we talk over them, and we say, well, here, do this. Here's a solution. That may not solve the problem, though. Now, when you engage in reflective listening by paraphrasing what they're saying and saying it back to them, you're not agreeing with their view of the problem. You're simply acknowledging how they see it. Those are different things. Oftentimes we interrupt and contradict because we disagree with how someone else views it. You're allowed to acknowledge what they're saying despite the fact that you disagree. Years ago, I was an RA, a resident assistant in the dorms. That means that I lived on the floor and I was supposed to take care of things. You know, if someone got locked out of their dorm room or something like that, I could let them in. I could solve disputes. I could solve problems. I was just someone available. One night, and I was asleep, and we were in a high-rise. We were on the 11th floor of a high-rise, and there's pounding on my door, and there's all these girls out there, and they said, Teresa's out on the ledge. Again, I'm asleep, so I'm confused. I don't understand. Who's on the ledge? We go running down to Teresa's room, and sure enough, she's on the ledge. She has crawled out the window from the 11th floor onto this ledge that was no more than maybe 5 inches wide, and she's at the far end of it. She had taken some drug, and I kind of forget, it was some drug people took back then. I don't remember what it was called, but she'd taken some drug, and she's mad at her boyfriend, and the boyfriend broke up with her, something like that. And I remember looking at her, middle of the night, she's on a 5-inch ledge on the 11th floor, there's nothing to hold on to. She's gesturing wildly because she's on drugs, and she's mad at her boyfriend. And I remember thinking, I'm looking at someone who's about to die. I don't see how she can even make it back in because she was on the far edge of she'd gone out the open part of the window and she's on the fixed part of the window edge. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't see how she can even get back in the room. But I listened to her, and if you think about it, her goal was related to her anger, and she was so mad. She said, people think I'm crazy. I'm not crazy. That jerk broke up with me. I hate his guts. I'm not crazy. She just kept repeating that she wasn't crazy. My thoughts were, the most important thing was getting her in the window, getting her back in the room safely. So her biggest concern was that people not think she was crazy. My biggest concern was, don't kill yourself. Who's mattered more? Well, if you ask me, mine did. But that's not where we had to go for this conversation. Think about whose behavior we're worried about here. Her big concern was that people not think she was crazy. So we have to address that concern. And so that's what I did. I said, no one thinks you're crazy. No one thinks that. People think you're upset because your boyfriend is a jerk. Now understand, I'm editing this quite a bit because I'm trying to placate her. Notice what I'm not saying. You are crazy. Come in off that ledge. You're going to kill yourself. I did not say that. I addressed her concerns. Finally, I said, no one thinks you're crazy, but I can't go to sleep again while someone's on the ledge. There's just a rule. I made all this stuff up, obviously. In other words, I needed to tether it to some external rule that didn't feel threatening to her. I said, you know what, there's just this rule about this. Wouldn't you just come in now? Then, and again, she's sitting on this ledge, this narrow ledge. She just jumped up and just walked in and climbed in the window. In a way, I thought maybe it's good she's on drugs. She doesn't realize that she should be this scared. At any rate, she didn't kill herself. It was a success. So realize what's happened here. I engaged in reflective listening. I addressed her concerns. I made a request to her that didn't challenge her sense of identity. All of those things, thank God, turned out with a good solution. But you have to get out of your own head and into the head of the other person. Ask questions to make sure you understand. Avoid argumentative questions. Avoid leading questions. Isn't it true that you did this and that? But don't you think this and that? There's no, that's a have you stop beating your wife kind of question. Sometimes there's no right answer to some of these questions. The way you framed them, they're so hostile. So you want to ask open-ended questions with the idea that you want to understand what someone's concerned about. If you're not sure exactly what they're referring to, if someone says, you're so unfair, and you're not sure where this is coming from, you can ask them. You can say, okay, can you give me an example? Working with a concrete bit of information helps you diffuse some of the emotion and to solve the problem. When discussions get difficult, it's often because they've been blown up so big, because there may have been a series of small things that just blew up. It may be more worthwhile, instead of saying, you're always doing something, to say, help me understand. Can you give an example of what you're saying? Again, remember that it's not always about you. Years ago, we had a new dean at the time. It's not our current dean. And the second time he met me, he started screaming at me. And honestly, in my decades of working, I have never been screamed at the way this man was screaming at me. And it was kind of irrational. And he's not still at the university, incidentally. But I remember thinking, he doesn't know me well enough to dislike me. So something else is going on, and it's not about me. And that actually was a helpful way to view it. Sometimes people are blowing up for something that isn't about you. So it's helpful to find out information from them. Make it safe not only for them to bring problems to you, but for them not to answer if you have questions. Sometimes they need more time. Finally, if you're going to have one of these conversations, speak for yourself. Just being silent doesn't necessarily protect you. You can speak without accusations, without judgment, but in a way that's powerful. Identify what your values are. Don't necessarily accept their framing of the problem. We've talked before about framing, and usually when a problem's been framed a particular way, we simply accept it later. You shouldn't necessarily do that. You can reframe what the issue is. Years ago, I worked on a case where the trial court made a decision that, in my opinion, was clearly wrong. I wasn't working on the case at that point. I came in for the appeal. However, the decision had gone against my client at the trial level. So now we were in mediation pending our appeal. And the other side said, okay, what are you going to offer us to settle the case? And what they're asking for there is, how much money will you pay us? Because, again, they'd gotten a judgment at the trial level against us. But they framed it as, how much money is your client going to pay us? But I rejected that framing and I said, the question isn't how much my client will pay you. The question is, how much will you be paying my client's costs of the appeal? Here's why. And I explained my view of the case and why the trial court was clearly wrong and the appeal had a very strong chance of succeeding, and if so, we would be entitled to attorney's fees. In other words, I changed the framing for my client's benefit. And it worked. We walked away without paying them a penny, which was the best possible outcome. My client, however, was so in a tizzy over this, as anyone would. You know, he'd been accused of bad stuff. But make sure that a problem is being framed in a way that appears to you to be accurate before you proceed with a settlement. Speak directly to people. Avoid passive aggressiveness. Comments that are really aggressive but are hiding behind something else. Just speak directly, speak calmly. Sometimes when it's a difficult conversation, we try to start slow to tiptoe our way in. And in a way that's foreboding to the other party, and they may wonder what's coming next, and it actually may make things worse. If you just speak directly and say, I wonder what you were thinking when you did this. Here's what happened. That's sort of a calm, easy way to talk about it. So think about how you can speak calmly and effectively for yourself. Well, that's the end of our 5-lecture discussion of difficult conversations. We'll be doing more in class, of course, and I hope it's given you some great tools. I think it's a good book.